Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take that stack of sources you sent over articles, bits of philosophy, historical research, and really pull out the essential knowledge you need.
And today's topic is a big one, a really
Yeah.
big one.
It's colossal. We're tackling a question that sort of defines how we see everything, both history and ourselves. Is humanity? Is it actually evolving morally? Are we climbing upward, toward something better?
Or is it just a shift? Are we just trading one set of values for another, like, I don't know, changing the wallpaper?
Exactly, like changing fashion trends. And that distinction, climb versus shift, that's the hinge for this whole deep dive. So to set the scene, I think we have to go straight to those shocking historical snapshots from the source material.
Yes, because they immediately challenge our modern assumptions. They're not just details. They're like tectonic plates of what was once considered moral reality. They've moved.
Let's start with maybe the most gruesome one. Not that long ago, really, within easily remembered history, public executions. They were treated as popular entertainment.
Civic entertainment, even? The sources are pretty clear on this. People would gather, bring their families, sometimes picnics. It was a day out.
To watch sanctioned, state-approved cruelty, the normalization of that,
Yeah.
it's horrifying to our modern sensibilities.
It is, and that tells you something profound. There's a massive difference in societal sensibility. Today, public torture isn't just illegal, it's, universally condemned by international law. It's seen as this profound violation of human dignity.
No, even if cruelty still happens, and it does, it's hidden. It's seen as shameful.
Right. Its institutional acceptance has basically vanished. And that is a major shift.
And it goes even deeper. Take chattel slavery, the actual ownership of human beings as property. For thousands of years, this wasn't just some fringe practice.
No, it was foundational. It was accepted as normal, even necessary across so many different societies and economic systems. It literally drove economies. It defined entire social structures.
And this wasn't a kind of passive acceptance.
Not at all. It was codified. It was supported by, detailed philosophical arguments and religious interpretations, all designed to justify the brutalization of one group by another.
It just shows how deeply a massive moral wrong can get baked in when it's sanctioned by the state, the economy, and, the leading intellectuals of the day.
Absolutely. And then you have the other examples from the sources, like the widespread exclusion of women from just the most basic rights.
Owning property, getting an education, voting. This was just standard operating procedure almost everywhere until, the late 19th or even 20th century in many places.
And of course, child labor. Dangerous routine exploitation of children fueling the Industrial Revolution. You read about 6-year-olds working 12-hour shifts in textile mills.
It's unthinkable. So those four things, public torture, slavery, the subjugation of women, child labor, they serve as these powerful, undeniable facts of history.
And when you contrast them with today's global norms, the condemnation of slavery, expanding rights for women, the legal ban on child labor, you are forced to confront just how profound these shifts in our collective behavior have been.
And this contrast, this movement away from all that institutionalized cruelty is what we tend to label moral progress. But here's where we have to hit the brakes. We need to challenge that label.
This is the core of it.
Is this a genuine climb upward? Does it suggest we're applying some absolute standard better than our ancestors? Or is it just a series of massive shifts in what people approve of?
Meaning future generations could look back at us and condemn something we see as a freedom, maybe, as our great moral failure.
Exactly. And that is our mission for this deep dive. We have to examine whether there's a true, objective moral standard that exists beyond just shifting human opinions.
Because if slavery and its abolition are just two equally valid cultural states, well, then the word progress has no real meaning.
But if we can find a standard, something like, say, the measurable reduction of unjust suffering, then we can start to build a case.
Then we could argue that our current state, for all its flaws, is demonstrably morally superior to the past.
So let's try to define that yardstick. Okay, so when we talk about moral progress, it can't just be a fuzzy feeling. It's a specific claim about history. What did that claim really require, fundamentally?
It requires, a pretty rigorous definition. Strictly speaking, the sources define moral progress as a measurable change over time from a worse moral state to a better one.
And how do we define worse and better?
A worse state would be characterized by greater injustice, more suffering, and what you might call moral blindness. A better state, then, is one with broader justice, less suffering, and greater ethical awareness. It's a qualitative evaluation.
Like a judgment call on history.
It is. And when proponents argue that this progress has actually happened, they consistently point to a very specific set of historical shifts. We've touched on them, but it's worth listing them out.
Right. The sources highlighted several key areas where people feel we've genuinely moved toward the better.
The most common example is the abolition, or at least the dramatic global reduction, of chattel slavery. That's number one. Then there's the huge expansion of what we call human rights.
Things like political participation, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. I mean, the basic architecture of a modern liberal state.
Exactly. And alongside that, you have the improved and, critically, the institutionalized treatment of marginalized groups.
So we're talking about better legal and social protections for women, children, racial and ethnic minorities, people with disabilities. That expansion of empathy seems like a huge step forward.
And it continues. As we move into our own century, there's the clear emergence of ethical debates that push beyond humans. I mean, growing concern for animal welfare, serious debates over factory farming, the rise of environmental policy.
So the ethical boundary keeps pushing outward.
It seems to be, but now you have to play the skeptic here, because if I look at the end of slavery and I call it progress, I'm making a huge value judgment. I'm saying the prior state was objectively worse.
And the skeptic, or maybe cultural relativists, would say, hold on, that's just your preference. That's your 21st century liberal ideology talking.
Precisely. And that's the central philosophical tension here. To call any of these changes progress, you have to assume there's an objective, universal moral reality, or at least some kind of universal, non-arbitrary standard of better and worse that stands outside of cultural preference.
So the person who says morality is just different across societies is basically throwing out the whole idea of moral truth.
They're rejecting that it exists independent of human opinion or historical context. That say if the standards shift, the only thing that changes is the preference. It's like preferring, I don't know, chopsticks to forks. There's no better or worse.
Which is a really challenging idea. If morality is just a social convention, like which side of the road we drive on, then we can't call a new convention progress. We can only call it change.
And the stakes here are enormous. For the term progress to be valid, to be meaningful, we have to believe that moral improvements are actually possible. In the same way, we believe we can discover new scientific facts that are true whether we believe in them or not.
If we can't establish that objective moral reality, then this whole deep dive is really just a discussion about changing habits.
That's right, it's just anthropology.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. So let's dive into the arguments that suggest these shifts are, in fact, deeper and more essential than just a mere preference. When you look at those big historical shifts, that gut feeling, that intuition, it's incredibly strong. It's the feeling that a world without chattel slavery is just objectively better than a world with it.
The sources really lean into this. They argue that this powerful intuition is a clue. It suggests that condemning genocide, for instance, feels qualitatively different from saying you prefer jazz to rock music.
It's not an aesthetic preference. It feels like you're engaging with a genuine ethical reality.
Right, but we need more than a feeling. So let's ground this in something more measurable. The first big argument is what the sources call the reduction of avoidable suffering.
Okay, so if history shows a clear reduction in widespread, avoidable, and unjust suffering, that has to qualify as progress. I mean, by any reasonable moral standard that cares about the well-being of conscious creatures.
That's probably the strongest objective marker we have. We can look at the institutionalization of cruelty. Let's go back to public torture. In the pre-modern era, the power of the state was often expressed through the public, theatrical destruction of the human body.
The sources describe things like drawing and quartering or public floggings, not just as punishments, but as a demonstration of sovereignty. A show of force.
A spectacle. Today, the near-total disappearance of that from state-sanctioned practice, at least publicly, represents a massive reduction in pain that is inflicted by institutions.
And as we said, even if state violence continues, it's generally hidden now. It's considered shameful. Before, it was a source of pride and power.
That shift in shame is a huge moral indicator. A society that provides legal protection for its most vulnerable children, the mentally ill, the elderly, is demonstrably less cruel than one that, say, forces them into dangerous labor or just warehouses them out of sight.
And you can measure that. You can measure it in pain avoided, in lives saved, in dignity preserved.
Exactly. But it's not just about what we stop doing. It's also about who we start caring for. This brings us to the second big argument. The idea of broader circles of concern.
Right. This details the historical expansion of who gets to count as fully human, or worthy of moral consideration in the first place.
And this is so compelling because it shows a clear directional trend. It's not a random back and forth. Historically, moral concerns started incredibly merrily.
Your immediate family, your tribe, your religious in-group.
And immorality often just stopped at the border or at the boundary of social class. Outsiders didn't count or didn't count as much.
But the historical narrative shows this relentless, if slow, expansion. It moves from tribalism to nationalism. Then it moves to these universal declarations of human rights that are supposed to transcend race and geography.
And you see it play out. The inclusion of all races, then the gradual and very painful inclusion of all genders, dismantling complex legal systems like coverture, where women were legally considered extensions of their husbands.
And this expansion hasn't stopped, has it? The sources point to the ongoing debates about animal welfare, the moral status of, say, dolphins and apes, and the whole movement to regulate factory farming.
We're even struggling with intergenerational justice now. How do our decisions today affect people who won't be born for hundreds of years? The moral circle, the definition of us, just keeps widening.
Okay, but I have to challenge this a bit, because if progress is just about applying principles we already had, why did it take millennia for societies, some with incredibly profound moral claims, to abolish something as obviously cruel as slavery?
That is the essential difficulty. And it's a great question because it leads to the third argument, the argument of value alignment and consistency. The delay doesn't negate the progress. It actually helps define the struggle.
So moral evolution, in this view, is the difficult process of closing the gap between a society's professed ideals and its actual conduct.
You've got it. A society might have had these core philosophical or religious claims about the inherent worth of the human soul or universal brotherhood.
But in practice, those claims were immediately cut off. They only applied to a select few. Wealthy, land-owning men of the dominant ethnic group, for example.
Exactly. And the classic historical example here is the abolitionist movement in the United States. They didn't really invent a new moral value. What they did was they weaponized the language that was already there in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal.
And they forced a slaveholding society to confront the massive, glaring contradiction between its founding documents and its entire economic reality.
That's the engine of this kind of progress. It's not about creating the idea of equality from scratch. It's about the painful, difficult act of recognizing and then implementing the moral truth that a society already claims to believe in, but to a wider and wider circle of people.
So we're not just changing fashion. We are slowly, painfully, learning a moral truth by reducing our own hypocrisy.
That is the core argument for genuine progress. The shift is from a state of high hypocrisy to a state of lower hypocrisy. And that feels like a real advance toward internal consistency, which is a powerful argument for genuine moral improvement, independent of mere preference.
That is a very strong defense of progress. But we absolutely need the counterweight now. It's far too easy for us to sit here in our time and assume we're at the moral peak.
Yeah.
We had that skeptical voice.
We do. Intellectual humility is essential here because the narrative of inevitable progress has historically been used to justify some pretty immense cruelties. Well, the idea that we are the advanced ones bringing civilization to the backwards people, that's a progress narrative. The skeptic cautions us against reading history backwards, assuming the path had to lead to us, the enlightened ones.
Okay, so the first major philosophical challenge that really tries to dissolve the whole idea of objective progress is cultural relativism.
Right. It's the view that different cultures and eras have genuinely different and often irreconcilable moral codes. And critically, there's no external objective scale you can use to weigh one against the other.
So what one culture calls progress, say, the move towards secular individual liberty, another culture might see as the ultimate moral decline.
Exactly. Imagine a society where familial duty and communal obligation are the absolute highest moral good. They might look at our Western emphasis on individual achievement and autonomy and see a moral catastrophe.
A cold, disconnected society that abandons its elderly and prioritizes selfishness over the survival of the group.
And if the relativist is right, both of those views are equally valid within their own internal systems. No true progress has occurred, just change. The very foundation of our discussion, the objective better, is completely undermined.
And that leads right into the next challenge. The idea that maybe we're not abolishing cruelty so much as we are innovating it. This is the challenge of new wrongs replacing old ones.
This one is sobering. We might have abolished chattel slavery, sure, but did we eliminate the fundamental human tendency toward exploitation and hierarchy? The skeptic would say no. We just replaced obvious physical evils with more subtle, pervasive, and systemic ones.
The sources were pretty blunt about this. We got rid of public torture. But what new, insidious problems have we created that our grandchildren will look back on and condemn us for?
The prime example, and it's a powerful one, is global-scale environmental damage. Past generations, for all their moral failings, simply lacked the technological capacity to systematically poison ecosystems on a planetary scale.
It's a new kind of harm. Our generation possesses this power, and our economic and moral frameworks are, well, driving us to use it disastrously. That feels like a new and catastrophic moral failure.
And it's not just the environment. Think about sophisticated propaganda and digital manipulation. We have tools now. Algorithmic radicalization, micro-targeting, surveillance capitalism that allow for the subtle, often invisible control of entire populations.
It's institutionalized harm dressed up as commerce or convenience.
It exploits our cognitive biases in ways our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Then there are new forms of economic exploitation, hidden away in complex global supply chains. You might buy a cheap t-shirt here.
And that low cost is only possible because of what amounts to near-slave labor conditions thousands of miles away, completely invisible to me as the consumer.
Right. So the suffering isn't eliminated, it's just externalized. It's made invisible. In this view, history isn't a straight line upward. It's a shifting landscape of harms. We get rid of one, and a new one, often more subtle and technologically enabled, emerges in its place.
That's a deeply sobering thought. And it connects to the final critique, which is about power, the mixture of power and morality. The idea that progress is often just the ideology of the winners.
This perspective demands that we look at our own self-assessment with extreme skepticism. History is just filled with examples of powerful empires describing their expansion as civilizing mission.
We're bringing democracy or order or the one true faith to the barbarians. That kind of thing.
And if you peel back that rhetoric, what you find is that one group's civilizing mission was the direct cause of another group's mass death, colonization, and the deliberate destruction of their culture. The moral narrative of progress was just the operating system for a political and economic agenda.
So when we look at history through that lens, we have to be incredibly cautious about patting ourselves on the back just because we're currently wealthy and militarily dominant.
Exactly. Perhaps our current condemnation of past actions just reflects our power structure and our preferred ideology, an ideology that will itself be seen as profoundly inadequate or maybe even barbaric by the people who come after us.
So we might be confusing our technological success with genuine ethical advancement, which forces us to look at this paradox of the tools we create. Let's pivot to the one area where I think everyone agrees there's been an upward trajectory: technology. No one seriously doubts that we've made progress in medicine, communication, transport. It's accelerating at a dizzying rate.
The capability is just staggering. We can sequence and edit the human genome. We can fly across the planet in a few hours. We can simulate reality in a computer. The tools we have are unimaginably more powerful than what our great-grandparents had.
It gives us this incredible power over nature and over ourselves. But here's the huge moral disconnect, and the sources really hammer this point home. This technological advancement, this explosion of power, is morally neutral.
Completely neutral. The technology itself doesn't come with a moral code attached.
Right. That capability can be used to heal millions of people with new medicines who would have just died in previous eras. We can coordinate humanitarian aid across the globe in an instant.
Or that exact same technical capacity can be weaponized to kill faster and more efficiently, to develop autonomous weapons that make life or death decisions without human oversight, to conduct mass surveillance.
Or to engineer the sophisticated propaganda campaigns we just talked about, which threaten the very foundations of democratic thought.
And we're not just talking about old tech. The sources point to the rise of AI and advanced bioengineering. We're gaining what you might call godlike powers to manipulate life and intelligence itself.
And we're being forced to make immediate moral decisions about these things, about bias in algorithms that decide who gets a loan or the ethical limits of human enhancement. Our ancestors just didn't have the power to even face these questions.
So the critical takeaway here is that the ability to do more, that sheer increase in power, does not automatically equate to being morally better. We've grown exponentially in our capacity.
But the real question of moral progress rests entirely on whether we have grown proportionally in wisdom.
That is the ultimate test. If moral progress is real, It can't be defined by our tools. It has to be defined by whether we use our massive technological power with greater wisdom, greater justice, and greater compassion than the generations before us who had so much less power to wield.
So if we have the power to globally coordinate and end famine, but we choose not to because of political or economic structures, that's not a technological failure. That's a profound moral failure.
It's a failure of will, not a failure of engineering. Power is just a magnifier. It magnifies whatever moral state we happen to be in. If we're morally advanced, it lets us do great good at scale.
And if we're morally compromised, it lets us commit unprecedented harm at scale.
Exactly. Which means we need to think about where that morality comes from, both in ourselves and in our societies.
Morality seems to exist on two distinct levels, and I think we need to pull them apart to see this clearly. We have the individual person, and then we have the collective structures of society.
Yes, the sources make a clear distinction between individual and collective ethics, and their relationship is really fascinating.
So individual progress,
Yeah.
that focuses on a single person's journey, right?
Yeah.
Their internal moral landscape.
It's the person who becomes more honest, or kinder, more just, more empathetic. It's the domain of personal virtue, character, self-improvement.
And then there's collective progress. This is the external stuff, the systems and structures, laws, institutions, public policies, social norms.
Right. Here we're looking for systems that become more fair, more compassionate, more capable of protecting the vulnerable. And what's really interesting and I think liberating is that systemic improvement doesn't require everyone to suddenly become a saint.
That's a huge point. A society can establish robust rights, it can abolish systemic cruelty, it can build crucial systems like universal education or public health care.
Even if many of the individuals within that society remain pretty selfish or prejudiced or just focused on their own self-interest.
So we don't need a utopia of perfect people to argue for moral progress. We just need better laws and structures that make cruelty harder and fairness the default.
It's like a societal mechanism for moral enforcement. For instance, a simple traffic law that says you have to stop for a pedestrian in a crosswalk. That's collective moral progress. It enforces a standard of care for the vulnerable.
Regardless of whether the driver's feeling particularly empathetic that day.
Exactly. The structure forces a better, safer, more ethical outcome for everyone.
Okay, but here's the challenge. Can we really separate them so cleanly? If the structures force moral outcomes, where do the structures come from in the first place?
And that's the interdependency. The sources remind us that laws are created, institutions are maintained, and sometimes unjust structures are resisted and torn down, all by individuals.
So you need individual reformers.
Mhm.
People like the suffragettes or the civil rights leaders, people who made profound personal moral commitments and had the courage to challenge the cruel or exclusionary status quo.
Without that individual moral courage, the collective system has no reason to change. It just coasts on inertia.
But it works the other way too, right?
Yeah.
Collective moral progress must shape individual morality over time.
It absolutely does. When you slowly dismantle institutional systems like, say, widespread legal racism or sexism, through things like enforced school integration or workplace equality laws.
New generations grow up with less internalized prejudice because their environment, their world, is consistently communicating a more equitable moral framework.
So the two are not separate silos, they're deeply intertwined. It's a reinforcing feedback loop. Individual ethical growth provides the spark for systemic change.
And systemic change provides the fertile ground for broader individual ethical development. You can't really have one without the other in the long run.
That's right. It's a constant dynamic interplay between the two.
Which brings us to what might be the most humbling and maybe the most important part of this deep dive. If we want to avoid that arrogance of the present, we have to accept the core lesson of the skeptic.
That every age is blind to its own worst sins.
Yes, this is the critical warning. We look back and we judge the Victorians for child labor, we judge the 19th century for its institutionalized sexism, but we have to turn that lens on ourselves. What are the pervasive practices we normalize today that future generations will look back on with horror?
And not just horror, but bewilderment. They'll wonder how could they not see it? Just as we wonder how people couldn't see the evil of slavery.
So let's spend some real time on this. The sources pointed to several major potential blind spots for our era.
The first, and arguably the most catastrophic, is the one we've touched on. Environmental destruction and our systemic failure to address climate change.
We have mountains of clear scientific evidence about the severe consequences of our actions. We know what's happening.
And yet our institutional structures, our economies, our politics, our cultures are all still prioritizing short-term consumption over the long-term stability of the planet.
Future historians are going to look at our documents, our scientific reports, and then look at our actions, and they'll find it completely indefensible.
They'll see the vast wealth and technical genius we poured into, frankly, trivial things, while we simultaneously neglected the foundational health of the only planetary system that can sustain us. It's a massive failure of intergenerational ethics.
A closely related blind spot is factory farming, the industrialized scale of animal suffering. This seems like a staggering moral contradiction.
It is. We've expanded our circle of concern to include our pets and endangered species. We get outraged about animal cruelty when we see it on video.
And yet we actively design, maintain, and profit from systems that inflict unimaginable, avoidable suffering on billions of sentient animals every single year.
All for the sake of dietary convenience and economic efficiency. If the reduction of avoidable suffering is a key metric for moral progress, as we said, then the industrialization of suffering has to be seen as a massive hidden regress.
We're creating suffering on a scale that was never possible before, and we justify it by just drawing this arbitrary line between human and non-human.
Another crucial modern blind spot is the one that's creeping up on us: digital manipulation and surveillance. We willingly participate in a system where our data is constantly extracted, and our behaviors, our preferences, our political views are monitored, influenced, and subtly controlled.
By massive entities, both governments and corporations, on a scale that would make previous totalitarian regimes green with envy.
This creates a new pervasive kind of harm. It erodes genuine democratic participation, it undermines individual autonomy, and it reduces complex human beings to predictable, monetizable data points. It's the hidden oppression of the digital age.
And it's all justified by the promise of convenience and personalization.
Finally, there's the persistence of extreme economic structures that trap millions in deep generational poverty, even within the wealthiest nations on Earth.
We have the resources, we have the technology, the logistics, the historical knowledge to provide for everyone's basic needs: food, water, shelter, medicine. The capacity is there.
And yet, vast, life-destroying inequality persists, often protected by the very legal and political mechanisms that are supposed to ensure fairness. Future generations, looking at our economic data, our wealth concentrations, they will rightly question our moral priorities.
So the humbling conclusion here is that acknowledging progress in one area, say in civil rights or LGBTQ+ rights, has to be balanced by admitting we may be terribly, terribly behind in others, like environmental ethics or economic justice.
It doesn't erase the progress we've made. The hard-won victories are real, but it forces us to see that moral improvement is always partial, incomplete, and highly prone to these massive blind spots hidden by the ideology and economy of our own time.
So if we're going to talk about this without just, patting ourselves on the back, we need to move from that intuitive feeling of progress to something more objective. We need concrete criteria. How do we define better in a way that isn't just our subjective preference?
Exactly. We need markers that you can, at least in theory, be observed and quantified across different time periods. The sources suggest 4 pretty powerful measurable criteria for genuine moral progress, all of which align with that core idea of increasing the well-being of sentient creatures.
Yeah. What's criterion number 1?
The one we keep coming back to: the reduction of avoidable suffering. This seems like the most immediate and undeniable metric of improvement.
And how would we measure that historically?
You'd look at things like rates of violence, legal protections against abuse, access to necessary resources like food and medicine, and the decline of cruel, institutionalized practices. You can compare, say, medieval Europe, where violence was pervasive, disease was rampant, torture was a state tool, to modern developed nations.
Where violence rates are, historically speaking, quite low, medical care has dramatically increased lifespans, and institutional cruelty is at least legally restricted.
And that word avoidable is key. A society that fails to intervene in a famine when it has the food and the drugs to do so is morally worse than a society that mobilizes those resources. Progress is closing that gap between what we can do and what we actually do.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second criterion?
The expansion of moral concern. We've talked about the widening circle, but as a measurement tool, it asks a simple question: are more beings and more types of beings included in the circle of care, dignity, and legal protection over time?
So you measure the legal and normative boundaries of who gets dignity. Does a society only care about its own citizens, or does it extend care to foreigners, refugees, children, people with profound disabilities, and even animals?
The historical arc from a morality focused only on the self or the tribe to a universalist morality that values all humans equally, regardless of where they were born, is a profound and measurable expansion of concern.
Right. So when we see international agreements protecting refugees or laws recognizing animal sentience, that's measurable progress on this metric.
Got it.
Number 3.
Criterion number 3 is increased fairness. Specifically, it's about reducing arbitrary disadvantage.
What counts as arbitrary?
Inherited traits you have no control over. Your race, your gender, where you were born, the class of your parents, your sexual orientation. If a society moves toward a system where success and failure are based more on effort, merit, and choice, and less on those random factors of birth, then fairness has increased.
And we can measure that. We can look at legal structures. We can look at data on economic and social mobility. Landmark rulings that dismantle systemic injustice like ending legal segregation or passing equal pay laws are clear examples.
Exactly. If the system systematically favors one group over another for an arbitrary reason, that society scores low on fairness.
Okay, and the final one, number 4.
Better alignment of ideals and practices. Or, put more simply, reduced hypocrisy. This brings us back to that earlier point, but it's critical for measurement.
So this measure asks, does a society actually live closer to the values it claims to hold?
Precisely. If a nation claims it's committed to free speech but systematically censors dissenting voices, its hypocrisy score is very high. Progress is that constant, painful process of confronting and reducing that hypocrisy.
So when a society, after a long struggle, finally grants voting rights to women, it's not inventing a new value. It's finally aligning its practice with the democratic ideal it claimed to hold all along.
And that closing of the hypocrisy gap is a powerful sign of moral maturity. And what's crucial here, as the sources note, is that these criteria themselves aren't value neutral. They assume that less suffering and more fairness are good things.
Which seems like a pretty safe assumption.
It does. But once you accept that basic commitment, that suffering is bad and dignity is good, these 4 criteria give you a robust framework. A way to argue that certain changes are genuinely better, not just different. They give us an external gauge to measure ourselves against.
Well, we have a strong case for why progress can be real, and we have objective criteria to measure it. But we can't look at history and just see a smooth, inevitable march forward. That's clearly not how it works.
No, and recognizing that is vital. If you hold a naive, simplistic view of progress as this automatic escalator going up, then any historical regress, any step backward, can lead to total despair.
And history is full of steps backward.
It often follows a really complex and brutal pattern. You get a significant moral advance, which is then followed by a fierce cultural and political backlash. That's followed by new, maybe partial advances, which can sometimes lead to entirely new crises.
You see the cycle everywhere, especially with the expansion of rights. A major legislative advance in civil rights for a minority group is often met immediately with a powerful, organized political resistance.
Sometimes resulting in the reversal of key protections or a new wave of disenfranchisement through different means. The sources gave that devastating example of what happened after World War I. You saw this rapid global expansion of liberal democratic ideas.
Only to be followed by the terrifying, brutal rise of fascism, Nazism, and totalitarian communism in the 1930s and 40s. A massive moral and political regress that led to atrocities on a scale never seen before.
It's a stark reminder that the moral knowledge gained in one generation does not automatically become the stable inheritance of the next. Progress isn't the default setting. It's a constant active process that requires immense moral labor.
It has to be fought for and maintained consciously.
Consciously. You see the rise of global institutions after 1945 aimed at preventing war, which was moral progress. But at the same time, you see the rapid descent into the Cold War and proxy conflicts that caused massive regional suffering, all in the name of political ideology.
The visualization the sources provided here is perfect. Moral history isn't a straight staircase. You don't just climb to the next level and you're safe forever.
It's much more like a jagged, uneven path on the side of a mountain, a really difficult climb. You take some steps forward, then you slide back. You take unexpected detours into dangerous terrain.
But the overall direction, over centuries, might still be upward. You might be climbing to a higher ethical altitude, but you are constantly negotiating treacherous ground.
And a failure to maintain your vigilance can send you tumbling back multiple paces. This more complex view is crucial because it integrates both realities. The reality of genuine, measurable progress like abolishing institutionalized cruelty, and the reality of terrifying regression and the emergence of new harms.
It acknowledges that this is a constant, painful, and necessary moral struggle.
Progress isn't a destination we just arrive at and get to rest. It's a direction we have to perpetually choose and actively fight for, both in the big halls of power by changing laws and in the quiet, individual effort of reducing our own hypocrisy.
This has been a really rigorous and, I think, necessary deep dive. Let's try to synthesize all of this for the listener.
So, to come all the way back to that core question we started with, is moral progress real, or are we just changing our values like we change our clothes? The balanced conclusion from analyzing these sources is a nuanced, conditional yes.
So the answer is that genuine progress is possible, and history shows us moments where it has clearly occurred.
Yeah.
But, and this is a huge but, it is always fragile, partial, and highly reversible.
There are strong, measurable reasons to believe that some historical changes really do count as real moral progress. Less state-sanctioned cruelty, a wider legal recognition of basic dignity, a growing concern for those who were once ignored. These are real advances because they tangibly reduce avoidable suffering.
They're not just shifts in taste, but the critical warning, the thing that has to guide our actions today, is that this progress is not some automatic law of history. It depends entirely on us.
We have to remember all the caveats. New harms appear as old ones fade. Our growing technological power can both help and hurt on a catastrophic scale. And crucially, every era, including our own, has profound moral blind spots that future generations will judge us for harshly.
Therefore, the wisest stance isn't one of naive self-congratulation, looking back at how much better we are. It's one of continuous moral vigilance.
Moral progress has happened, but it remains a continuous task we have to fight for, every day, lest we stumble backward into the very cruelties we thought we had left behind. It's a perpetual, jagged struggle, not a completed ascent.
Which brings us to you, the listener. If this deep dive into historical morality has sparked your own ethical engine, we want to leave you with 3 specific, provocative questions to really reflect on. First, which changes in today's world, using those 4 criteria we discussed, reduction of suffering, expansion of concern, increased fairness, and reduced hypocrisy, which changes look like real, measurable moral progress to you. Can you find the evidence to back that up? Second, what might future generations see as our biggest moral failures? Given what we know about our current blind spots, the environment, economic inequality, digital surveillance, what is one normalized behavior you are willing to challenge right now to move it out of the blind spot and into the light? And finally, what can you do, individually in your choices and collectively through your engagement in your community, to push your corner of the world just a little closer to genuine justice and compassion? Because the progress of the world really does start with the consistent application of your own values.
Thank you for joining us for this crucial deep dive into the moral landscape of humanity.
We'll see you next time.